The Grand Convocation Chamber had seen its share of conflicts. It had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the forging of uneasy alliances, and the tentative handshake of peace between civilizations that had once sworn to annihilate one another. But today, for the first time in its long and storied history, it watched in stunned silence as an entire species turned its back on the galaxy and walked away. Ambassador Elias Carter stood at the edge of the central negotiation table, his hands resting firmly on the polished obsidian surface. The faint blue glow of the holographic treaty flickered between him and the assembled delegates, a testament to the diplomatic efforts that had spanned months, no, years, of deliberations. Yet, in the end, the words displayed in shimmering light amounted to little more than a list of demands, restrictions, chains, carefully disguised as accords. Across the table, Supreme Chancellor Veltaris of the Voran Imperium shifted uneasily, his iridescent black carapace catching the light. His mandibles clicked in what Elias recognized as a sign of unease. The other representatives, some avian, some reptilian, some beings of liquid or light, exchanged nervous glances, waiting, watching. Elias exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had spent his entire career believing in diplomacy, believing in the dream of a united galaxy, of different species working together not just for survival but for prosperity. He had believed in the Assembly's mission, but today that belief was dying. "We came here in good faith," he said, his voice even, though a storm brewed beneath the surface. "We came here willing to compromise, willing to find common ground, willing to work toward a peace that benefits all. And yet, every concession has been asked of us. Every demand is placed on our shoulders. Every compromise is ours to make." He raised his gaze, looking directly into Veltaris's multifaceted eyes. "You call this peace?" he asked, his voice hardening. "This isn't peace, it's surrender." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some of the more nervous species shifted in their seats. Others exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. High Minister Garzek of the Thraval Dominion leaned forward, his bioluminescent tendrils pulsing with agitation. "Ambassador Carter, please. We understand your concerns, but you must see the bigger picture. The galaxy is on the brink of war. The specter of conflict looms over us all. We must find a way to prevent—" Elias cut him off. "And yet, every clause of this treaty is designed to weaken humanity. Restrictions on our military, limits on our expansion, economic sanctions disguised as regulations, even the disarmament clauses, the very ones that allow the rest of you to keep your fleets while demanding that we decommission ours." His gaze swept across the room. "This isn't about peace. It's about containment. You fear what we might become, so you seek to cripple us before we have the chance." Veltaris's mandibles clicked again, this time in irritation. "Your people are dangerous, Ambassador. You expand too quickly, you innovate too fast, you refuse to submit to the natural hierarchy of the galaxy, you do not ask for permission, and that terrifies the others here." Elias let out a short, humorless laugh. "And yet, when the Caracord burned entire worlds to ash, you negotiated with them. When the Zalari supremacy enslaved entire species, you tolerated them. You make deals with warlords and tyrants, but humanity? We're the ones who need to be shackled." He shook his head, the bitter taste of betrayal heavy on his tongue. "No, we see through this, and we refuse." A hush fell over the chamber. No species had ever outright rejected a peace treaty once it had reached this stage. Negotiations could fail, yes, but never like this. Never with one party standing in open defiance of the entire assembly. "Ambassador Carter," Veltaris said carefully, his voice a warning, "you understand the consequences of this decision, don't you?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Perfectly." Veltaris's mandibles twitched, his eyes narrowing. "If you walk away, humanity walks alone. The Assembly will not protect you. Your trade agreements will collapse. Your allies will distance themselves. Do you truly wish to stand against the entire galaxy? Elias took a slow step back from the table. Behind him, the rest of the human delegation followed suit. Admiral Lucia Kane's expression was unreadable, but the glint in her eyes told him she was more than ready for this outcome. General Tomas Varga stood like a statue, his broad frame exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had seen too many wars to fear another. Elias let the silence stretch for a moment before he finally answered, "We've stood alone before." And then he turned his back on the assembly. The humans walked away, their boots echoing against the marble floors, each step a quiet declaration of defiance. The massive doors to the chamber slammed shut behind them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then panic erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as diplomats turned to one another in hushed, frantic whispers. Some species, the ones who had always supported humanity in secret but never dared to voice it, looked shaken. Others, the ones who had pushed hardest for the restrictions, looked uneasy, because now there was nothing binding humanity to the assembly. Now they had nothing to lose. Valtharis remained frozen, his fingers still splayed against the table. The consequences of what had just happened sank into him with a weight he had not anticipated. "Supreme Chancellor," a voice said urgently, one of his aides, a wiry, four-armed reptilian from the Jahalan Protectorate. "What do we do?" Valtharis did not answer immediately. His mind raced. Humanity had always been unpredictable. Unlike other civilizations, which had slowly spread across the stars over millennia, humanity had ignited like a wildfire. In less than 5 centuries, they had gone from a single-planet species to one of the most powerful militaries in the known galaxy. Their adaptability, their relentless innovation, their refusal to accept their place in the galactic hierarchy. It had made them both admired and feared, and now they were untethered. No regulations, no oversight. For years, the Assembly had operated under the belief that they were guiding humanity, controlling their growth just enough to keep them in check. But in that moment, Valtharis realized the truth. They had never been guiding humanity. Humanity had simply been tolerating them. A cold dread settled in his stomach. "The male will prepare for war," one of these Zolari delegates whispered, his voice trembling. "That is what they do. That is what they have always done." "And we must prepare as well," another said. Valtharis closed his eyes, listening to the rising panic. It was already too late. The worst had already begun. The silence in the transport vessel was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines as it drifted away from the assembly spire. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced viewport, cold and distant, indifferent to the choices made within the halls of galactic power. Elias Carter exhaled slowly, his hands resting on his knees as he leaned forward, staring at nothing in particular. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, a quiet but undeniable force. The entire room, every delegate, every representative, every species that had gathered in the chamber had expected humanity to accept the terms, to bow, to kneel under the weight of diplomacy. But humanity had never been one to kneel. "Well," Admiral Lucia Kane said at last, her voice edged with dry amusement, "that went about as well as I expected." General Tomas Varga let out a low grunt. "Could have gone worse. Could have had to fight our way out." Elias shook his head. "Not yet, but it's coming." Across from him, Minister Ario Vasquez of the Terran Union's Foreign Affairs Committee shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had spent years negotiating with alien species, mastering the delicate balance of diplomacy and politics required to keep humanity on stable footing within the assembly. Now, that balance had shattered. "They'll retaliate," she said, voicing the thought none of them had yet dared to say aloud. "They won't just let us walk away." Lucia folded her arms, the sharp lines of her uniform emphasizing the hardened muscle beneath. "No, they won't. They'll try to strangle us with economic sanctions first. cut our trade routes, pressure our allies to abandon us, and if that doesn't work—" She trailed off, her gaze dark. "They'll bring war," Tomas finished. A cold truth settled over them. For years, the Assembly had masked its fear of humanity under the guise of unity. They had offered treaties with one hand while reinforcing their own fleets with the other. They had allowed human colonies to expand, but only under strict oversight. They had spoken of peace, but ensured that humanity's military remained under constant scrutiny. But the moment the humans had called their bluff, the moment they had refused to sign away their sovereignty, the illusion had crumbled. Elias rubbed his temples. "We have two options. We can try to salvage this diplomatically, reach out to the factions within the Assembly that aren't completely against us, or we prepare for war," Lucia said bluntly. Thomas met her gaze, something fierce and unyielding in his expression. "We should have been preparing for war years ago." Arya frowned. "You think we should escalate things? Push them into conflict?" Tomas scoffed. "They're going to come for us whether we want them to or not. The only difference is whether we're ready when they do." Lucia nodded in agreement. "I'd rather fight on our terms than theirs." Elias exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. "We're not there yet, but we need to start thinking ahead. The Union needs to be ready. If they cut our trade routes, we need supply chains in place. If they try to blockade us, we need contingency plans." Arya looked at him. "And if they attack?" Elias met her gaze without hesitation. "Then we remind them why they fear us in the first place." The words hung in the air. The galaxy had seen humanity fight before. The wars of expansion, the colonial skirmishes, the battles against the Carrick horde, the stories had spread like wildfire across the stars. The humans fought like no other species. They adapted, they endured, and above all, they refused to surrender. For years, the Assembly had told themselves that they were keeping humanity in check, but Elias had seen the truth now. Humanity had never been controlled. They had simply been waiting. And now, the waiting was over. The transport ship continued its silent journey away from the Assembly spire, cutting through the darkness of space. Somewhere, deep in the void, war was coming, and humanity would be ready. On the surface of Vorin Prime, the capital world of the Vorin Imperium, Supreme Chancellor Veltaris stood before a massive holographic display in his private chambers. The images flickered, news feeds, reports, live footage from the Assembly spire. Every channel, every broadcast was the same. The humans were leaving. Veltharis's mandibles clicked in frustration. "This is a disaster," he said, his voice sharp. "They were supposed to accept. They were supposed to submit." Across from him, Minister Kelator of the Jelari Supremacy inclined his elongated head, his crimson eyes unblinking. "You expected them to kneel?" he asked, his tone almost amused. Veltharis turned sharply. "They had no choice. The alternative is war, and even the humans aren't foolish enough to think they can stand against the entire Assembly." Kelator let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "Aren't they?" The words sent a chill through the room. Veltaris clenched his fingers. "We have to act. We must contain them before they consolidate their power." "Contain them how?" asked High Minister Garzek, who had joined the emergency meeting via holographic transmission. "They've already severed their ties with the Assembly. They are no longer bound by our regulations. Any action we take against them now will be seen as an act of war." "Then so be it," Veltharis snapped. "We cannot allow them to become a threat. We must strike before they do." Kelator's eyes gleamed with something predatory. "You think we can win such a war?" Veltharis turned back to the holographic display, staring at the departing human fleet. The ships were sleek, their hulls reinforced with the newest alloys humanity had developed, their engines burning hot as they accelerated away from assembly space. Each one was a testament to human ingenuity, human stubbornness, human defiance. "They are alone," he said firmly. We will cut off their resources. We will turn their allies against them. We will break them before they have the chance to fight back." Kelator remained silent for a moment before nodding. "Then we must move quickly." Valtharis clenched his mandibles. "Summon the War Council. Humanity has chosen its path. Now, we ensure they regret it." The first signs of the Assembly's retaliation came swiftly. Within days of humanity's departure from the peace talks, trade restrictions were imposed. Supply lines that had once flowed freely to human colonies were suddenly choked by bureaucratic red tape. Allied species that had once benefited from human technology were pressured to sever ties. The message was clear: submit or suffer the consequences. But humanity had seen this coming. On the industrial world of Mars, factories worked around the clock, shifting production towards self-sufficiency. On the fortress moon of Titan, shipyards churned out warships at an unprecedented rate. Across the outer colonies, militia forces were trained, weapons were distributed, and contingency plans were activated. The humans had not spent their years in the assembly idly. They had been preparing. Elias stood in the command center of the Terran Union's headquarters on Luna, watching as reports poured in. His fingers drummed against the console as he scanned the latest intelligence. "They think they can starve us out," Lucien muttered beside him. "Idiots." Elias nodded. "They don't understand us. They never have. They think we're like them, content to sit and negotiate while they tighten the noose." Tomas smirked. "They're going to learn." The Assembly thought it could control humanity through diplomacy. Now it would learn what happened when humanity was truly free. War wasn't just coming. It had already begun. The blockade of the Sol system began 6 weeks after the humans walked away from the peace talks. The Assembly had moved faster than expected, mobilizing a coalition of fleets under the guise of containment efforts. Officially, they claimed it was a necessary measure to maintain stability and prevent unilateral human expansion. Unofficially, it was an act of war in everything but name. Elias Carter stood on the bridge of the TUS Endeavour, one of the Terran Union's newest diplomatic vessels, though it had been retrofitted for defense after the collapse of negotiations. The viewport displayed a massive holographic feed of the blockade forces surrounding Sol's outer perimeter. Dozens of warships from various species, their hulls gleaming in the distant glow of the sun. The blockade wasn't total yet, but it was clear what was happening. "They're pushing their luck," Admiral Lucia Kane muttered beside him. Her arms were crossed, her sharp gray eyes scanning the blockade forces with the practiced scrutiny of a veteran commander. "I count at least 4 dreadnoughts in that sector alone. They're not here for negotiations." "They think we'll bend," Elias replied, keeping his voice level. "That we'll panic and come crawling back to the table." "Then they don't know us at all," General Tomas Varga growled, leaning against the command console. His cybernetic fingers drummed against the surface, each metallic tap carrying the barely restrained aggression of a man who had spent decades fighting humanity's wars. Aria Vasquez sighed from her seat nearby, rubbing her temples. "We can't afford a full-scale war, Elias, not yet. The blockade isn't a direct attack, not unless they start firing." Lucia scoffed. "A blockade is an attack, cutting off trade, forcing our allies to sever ties, posturing with warships at our doorstep. They might as well have declared war already." Elias exhaled slowly, focusing on the larger strategy at play. The Assembly thought this would cripple humanity, that isolating them from galactic trade would bring them to their knees. But they had made a critical mistake. Humanity had never relied on the Assembly to survive. "They don't understand what they've just done," he said at last. "They think they're forcing us into submission, but all they're really doing is giving us something we've never had before, complete independence." Aria frowned. "They're cutting us off from resources, trade, commerce." "They're forcing us to become self-sufficient," Elias interrupted. "They're forcing us to rely only on ourselves, and if there's one thing humans do better than any other species in this galaxy, it's adapt." Lucia smiled slightly, nodding in approval. "We don't break, We just find another way. The Terran Union had spent the past few centuries integrating into the galactic economy, but at its core, humanity had always been built on resilience. Earth had endured world wars, economic collapses, natural disasters, and existential threats long before it ever reached the stars. The colonies had thrived in hostile environments, in places no other species would have considered habitable. If the Assembly thought they could simply starve humanity into submission, they were gravely mistaken. Still, we need to move carefully, Elias admitted. We can't afford to make the first move. If we fire first, the Assembly gets exactly what they want, an excuse for war. But if they make a mistake, if they escalate this beyond containment, then we hit back, Tomas finished. Lucia's expression darkened. Hard. Elias nodded. Hard enough that they'll regret ever thinking they could put a leash on us. The command center fell into silence. Outside, the stars remained indifferent to the war brewing beneath them. In the Assembly spire, Supreme Chancellor Veltharis sat at the head of an emergency council meeting, his mandibles clicking in irritation as the representatives from the blockade fleet reported in. The transmission flickered as Grand Marshal Kex of the Jahalan Protectorate, one of the lead military commanders overseeing the blockade, delivered his assessment. The humans have not attempted to breach the perimeter, Kex reported, his scaled face expressionless. No aggressive movements, no direct confrontations. They are holding their positions within Sol. Veltharis tapped his fingers against the table. And their supply situation? We have confirmed that several of their primary trade partners have cut ties under Assembly pressure. The economic sanctions are in effect, and our intelligence suggests disruptions in several key industries. However, Kex hesitated. The reptilian commander exhaled, clearly displeased with his own report. The humans are adapting faster than anticipated. Their colonies are reorganizing supply chains, shifting production toward self-sufficiency. Shipbuilding facilities on Mars and Titan have increased output. Their energy sectors remain operational. And worst of all, their black market networks are compensating for the trade restrictions. Veltharis's mandibles twitched in frustration. So, the blockade is failing? Kex hesitated. Not yet, but it is not having the effect we expected. The humans are resourceful. Veltharis clenched his jaw. Of course they were. That was what had made them such a problem in the first place. Unlike other species which depended on the stability of the Assembly to maintain their civilizations, humanity had always functioned on the edge of chaos. They didn't need permission to thrive. Then we escalate, Veltharis decided. Begin fleet movements near the outer colonies, pressure their supply lines further. If they respond aggressively, we will have our justification to strike. One of the other council members shifted uncomfortably. And if they do not? Veltharis exhaled sharply. Then we keep tightening the noose until they have no choice but to lash out. The war was inevitable. The only question was who would fire the first shot. In the outer reaches of the Sol system, a Terran Union patrol fleet drifted through the void, watching the blockade forces carefully. The lead vessel, Tuss Valiant, maintained a steady course just outside of the Assembly's declared containment zone, its weapons powered down, but ready. Captain Helena Sharp sat in the command chair, her hands resting lightly on the armrests as she monitored the tactical readouts. The blockade fleet was holding position, but tension crackled through the comms. The wrong move, by either side, could set the entire galaxy on fire. "Captain," her comms officer called out, "we're picking up movement in the blockade formation. One of their cruisers is repositioning." "Wait!" The officer's voice tightened. "They're locking weapons on us." Sharpie's eyes narrowed. "Confirm." A pause. "Confirmed, targeting sensors active. They're painting us." A slow exhale. A decision to be made. "Down. Hold position. Do not raise shields. Do not arm weapons." The bridge crew tensed, but they obeyed. On the tactical display, the Assembly warship remained locked onto them, its posture aggressive. "Comms, open a channel," Sharp ordered. The holographic display shifted as a reptilian face appeared, Captain Exroth of the Elvaran fleet, one of the blockade enforcers. His voice was sharp, edged with authority. "Terran vessel, you are in violation of assembly containment directives. Disengage immediately or you will be fired upon." Sharp's expression remained impassive. "This is neutral space. We have the right to patrol our own borders." "You are a threat to galactic stability," Exroth snapped. "Last warning, stand down or we will take action." Sharp's fingers tapped idly against the chair. They were testing her, seeing how far they could push before humanity reacted. If she backed down, it would set a precedent. If she engaged, it would be war. She made her decision. "No," she said simply. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the assembly warship fired the first shot. A pulse of energy streaked across the void, slamming into the Valiant's hull. The impact sent a tremor through the ship, but the armor held. Alarms blared across the bridge. Sharp's voice remained calm as she gave the order that would change the course of history. "Return fire." The Valiant's railguns roared to life, and in that instant, the war humanity had been preparing for had begun.